On Thanksgiving Day, my mother-in-law stood at the head of her dining room table, pointed straight at the front door, and said, "Take your daughter and go home." My 6-year-old Harper had been coloring a turkey she'd drawn on a paper plate and stopped the moment those words left my mother-in-law's mouth. She looked up at me with a crayon still in her hand. Every adult at that table found somewhere else to look. 7 years later, my mother-in-law called me from a hospital waiting room, crying, asking me to come back to Raleigh. I almost didn't answer. What I decided to do next surprised even me. Stick with me, because nothing about that decision went the way I expected. Before we get into it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you're new here, consider subscribing. We share stories like this every week. The Thanksgiving that split everything in two didn't begin as a disaster. Harper and I pulled up to my mother-in-law Roberta's house in North Raleigh just before noon, carrying a sweet potato casserole I'd made from scratch, and a paper bag full of crayons and coloring books, so Harper would have something to do between courses. My husband Andre met us at the door. The yard looked the way it always did, well-kept and deliberate, the kind of yard that told you exactly how much the owner cared about appearances. I had known since the beginning of my marriage that Roberta and I were not going to be easy. She hadn't said so directly. Roberta was too composed for direct statements, but she had told me in 100 smaller ways, talking over me at family dinners, referring to the apartment Andre and I shared as Andre's place, even when I was standing right beside her, once complimenting my cooking by saying it was good for someone who learned from YouTube. She smiled when she said it, which somehow made it worse. I had grown up in Fayetteville, North Carolina, in a family that worked hard and rented their whole lives. My parents were good people who moved 3 times when I was a kid, because landlords kept selling out from under them. I understood from a very early age the difference between stability and the illusion of stability, and which one we had. I was putting myself through community college the night I met Andre at a mutual friend's birthday party, and Roberta had never quite forgiven me for that first impression. She believed her son deserved someone who arrived with a 4-year degree and a career that came with business cards. I arrived with a waitressing job and a plan I was still working out. By the time Harper was born, I was working full-time at a breakfast diner while finishing my associate's degree online after Harper went to sleep. Roberta never called what I did work. She called it what Zoe does until she figures things out. That Thanksgiving afternoon, I set the casserole on the kitchen counter and noticed the table was set for 9. Harper and I were 2 of the expected guests. Roberta and my father-in-law Edmund made 4. Andre's sister Kezia made 5. I didn't recognize the 9th seat. Andre told me quietly, while Harper arranged her crayons at the small folding table set up for her in the corner, that a woman from Roberta's church was joining them, an old friend who had recently moved back to Raleigh. I let it go. She arrived 20 minutes later, carrying a pecan pie, mid-30s, dressed like she had somewhere important to be afterward, and she greeted Roberta with a warmth that told me immediately this was not their first meeting. She sat down at the table and smiled at me in the pleasant surface-level way of someone who already knows your name and has decided not to mention how. Dinner went well enough at first. Harper ate her turkey without complaint, charmed Edmund into teaching her a card trick between courses, and colored 3 separate turkey drawings on paper plates while the adults talked. I watched the woman across the table. She and Roberta kept exchanging glances that landed just slightly to the left of where I was sitting. The way people do when they are running a conversation you were not invited into. It was during the pie that Roberta tapped her water glass. She thanked everyone for coming. She said she had been doing a lot of thinking about what was best for this family. She looked in my direction, but not at me, more the way you look at a problem you have already decided to solve. She said Andre deserved stability. She said Harper deserved a household that made sense. I set down my fork. She had been talking to their pastor, she said, and to people she trusted, and everyone agreed that sometimes the kindest thing was honesty before more time passed. What exactly are you saying? I asked. I'm saying, she said carefully, that maybe staying together for Harper's sake isn't actually best for Harper. I looked at my husband. He was studying the tablecloth. And you thought Thanksgiving dinner was the right time for this? I said. I thought having everyone who loves this family in one place was the right time, she replied. I glanced at the woman beside her, including someone Harper has never met. Roberta's expression shifted just barely. I invited a friend to dinner, that's my right in my own home. It is, I said, but this doesn't feel like dinner anymore. You're making this difficult, she said. You always make things difficult. Harper had stopped coloring. She was watching us from her folding table, with the particular stillness children develop. They sense something is wrong, but don't have the words for it yet. I kept my voice even. I'm making things difficult by asking what's happening at my own family's Thanksgiving? Roberta stood. She moved deliberately, the way people do when they've rehearsed. This is my house, she said, and I will not sit here while you make everyone uncomfortable. She pointed at the front door. Take your daughter and go home before you make this worse for everyone. No one at the table said a single word. Edmund looked at his plate. Kezia reached for her water glass. Andre did not look up. Harper slid off her chair without being asked, and walked over to me in quiet, small steps. She didn't say anything, she just took hold of the edge of my sleeve. I stood up slowly. I pushed my chair in, I walked to the corner and put Harper's crayons back in the paper bag one at a time. I took my daughter's hand, got my purse from the coat closet, and walked out the front door into the November cold. The air outside was sharp in the way late November in North Carolina gets. Not quite freezing, but the kind of cold you feel in your chest before you feel it on your skin. Harper held my hand all the way to the car. Once I had her buckled into her booster seat and the door closed, she asked, "Did we do something wrong, Mommy?" I turned around to look at her. "No, baby, we didn't do anything wrong." "Then why did we have to leave?" I didn't have an honest answer that was also appropriate for a 6-year-old. I told her we were going to have our own Thanksgiving, just the two of us. "With the casserole?" she asked. "We left the casserole." She considered that. "That's okay," she said finally. "We can make macaroni." Something about those 4 words broke and rebuilt something in me, at exactly the same moment. We drove back to our apartment. I called my mother in Fayetteville, held the phone away from my face so Harper wouldn't hear me, and talked for 20 minutes while my daughter sat at the kitchen counter teaching herself to draw a turkey by tracing her hand on a piece of notebook paper. That night I made stovetop macaroni and cheese and sliced apples, and we ate at the kitchen table while Harper showed me the card trick Edmund had taught her. She practiced it on me 11 times. I let her fool me every single one. Before she fell asleep, she said, "Next Thanksgiving, can we invite Grandma from Fayetteville?" Yes, absolutely yes. My marriage did not survive the winter. Andre and I had one long quiet conversation in December. He said his mother had meant well. I told him that wasn't the question I needed answered. What I needed to know was why he had sat there studying the tablecloth, while someone pointed at the door, and told his wife and daughter to leave, and he could not tell me. We separated in January and finalized the divorce 8 months later. The divorce left me with joint custody of Harper, a 1-bedroom apartment I could barely afford, and the understanding that I needed to build a life that nobody else could dismantle by pointing at a door. I had been thinking about real estate for years. I had grown up watching my family rent, always at the mercy of someone else's decision to sell or raise the rate, or simply change their mind about who they wanted living in their house. I knew what it felt like to have your stability depend on another person's signature, and I knew I didn't want that for Harper or for myself. A former coworker of mine had moved to Atlanta 2 years earlier and had not stopped talking about its job market since. 6 months after the divorce, with a moving truck, my daughter, 2 suitcases, and $1,100 in savings, I drove south on I-85. Atlanta did not ease us in gently. We rented a studio apartment in Decatur small enough that I could nearly touch both walls of the bathroom with my arms outstretched. Harper slept in the main room behind a curtain I hung on a tension rod to give her something like her own space. I took every waitressing shift I could find and used the nights Harper spent at her father's, every other weekend, to study for my real estate pre-licensing exam. I failed the first time by 4 points. I cried in the parking lot for about 10 minutes. Then I went back inside and scheduled the next available date. I passed on my second attempt. My first year selling real estate, I earned less than I had waitressing. My second year, a little more. By year 4, I had moved us into a 2-bedroom apartment where Harper had her own actual door and I had a desk in the corner of the living room where I worked after she went to sleep. By year 6, I had my broker's license and had opened a small office with one other agent. We focused on first-time buyers, people who needed someone to explain the process without making them feel stupid for not already understanding it. I answered my own calls. I worked Saturdays. I knew what it felt like to be on the wrong side of a housing decision, and I wanted the people who sat across from me at the closing table to feel like they'd ended up on the right side of one. Harper grew in ways I watched up close and still couldn't fully explain. She was organized in a way I had never been at her age, kept her homework in color-coded folders, set her own alarm by 3rd grade, had opinions about everything from restaurant menus to how I arranged the kitchen cabinets. She played soccer, loved the game and hated the drills, and read books the way some kids watch television, constantly and without apology. She was becoming, in the best possible way, entirely herself. The call came 7 years after Thanksgiving. Harper and I were at a consignment store on a Saturday morning, looking at bookshelves for her room. She was 13 by then, long-limbed and particular about aesthetics. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket, and I pulled it out expecting a client. It was Andre. I handed Harper my card and stepped toward the back of the store. "I wasn't sure you'd pick up," he said. "I almost didn't." A pause. "It's my mom. She had a stroke last month. She's home but she can't manage on her own. And my dad had knee surgery in September and he's still not back to full strength. Kezia's holding everything together but she's exhausted. It's too much for one person." I leaned against a shelf of old picture frames. How serious was the stroke? "Her left side is weaker. She's doing physical therapy, but she gets frustrated and quits, which makes it worse." He was quiet for a moment. "She's been asking about Harper." "She's been asking about Harper," I repeated. "About both of you," he said. "I know I have no right to ask you anything. I just thought you deserved to know what was happening up here." After we hung up, I stood in the back of that store for a long moment. Harper found me holding my phone and staring at nothing. "Was that Dad?" "Yes." "Is something wrong?" "Your grandmother had a stroke." Her face changed. She had been 6 the last time she'd seen Roberta, barely a memory, but she said, "Is she going to be okay?" "She's working on it." Harper watched me carefully. She had always been good at reading the space between what I said and what I hadn't said yet. "Are we going to go see her?" I didn't answer in the store. On the drive home she looked out the window without pressing me, which was the most gracious thing a 13-year-old could have done. That night, after she went to bed, I sat at my desk for a long time. I was not afraid of seeing Roberta again. What I was afraid of was the work it would take to walk back into that house honestly. Without pretending, without softening the edges of what had happened, without falling back into the person I had been the last time I sat at that table. 3 days later I rearranged my appointments, packed 2 bags, and drove north on I-85 with Harper in the passenger seat. Raleigh felt more familiar than I expected and smaller than I remembered. We passed the neighborhood where Andre and I had lived. The apartment complex had been repainted. I wouldn't have recognized it if I hadn't known to look. Roberta's house was in a quiet subdivision in North Raleigh. The yard was still neat, but the porch light was out, and the mailbox was stuffed with flyers nobody had cleared. Harper looked at it through the window and said, "It looks like someone's been tired for a while." That was exactly what it looked like. We knocked. Andre opened the door, looking older in the quiet way 7 years ages a person. He stepped aside. The house smelled like medication and old carpet freshener. The furniture hadn't moved. Roberta was in a recliner in the living room. She had lost weight. Her left hand rested on the armrest at an angle that looked effortful to hold, and when she saw us her expression moved through surprise, something close to relief, and then something I couldn't immediately name. Harper said, "Hi, Grandma Roberta." Roberta blinked. "You're so tall." "I'm 13. "I know." Her voice was slower than I remembered. "I know exactly how old you are." I helped Roberta to the kitchen, while Harper and Edmund settled in the living room. Edmund called her Miss Sunshine, before she'd even sat down. Harper looked at him the way you look at something you didn't know you'd been missing. Kezia arrived 20 minutes later, still in her work badge from the hospital billing department, where she'd picked up a weekend shift. She stopped in the kitchen doorway when she saw me. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come," she said. "Neither was I." She sat at the table and looked at her hands for a moment. "I've been thinking since Andre called about what I'd say to you if you did." "You don't have to say anything." "I do." She looked up. "At Thanksgiving, when she pointed at the door, I reached for my water glass." "I remember." "That was deliberate," she said. "I knew what was happening. I knew it wasn't right, and I reached for my water glass because it was easier than speaking up. The kitchen was quiet. "I've been reaching for the water glass my whole life," she said. "I thought it made me the easy daughter, the one who didn't cause problems. What it actually made me was someone who let things happen to other people, because staying quiet was more comfortable than the alternative." She looked exhausted in a way that went deeper than the work badge and the long Saturday. "After you left, Mom turned all of that toward me," she continued. "Every decision I made, my kids, my husband, our money, where we lived, she had an opinion about all of it, and I kept telling myself she meant well. I said it at that Thanksgiving table, and I said it for years after. I had a whole collection of reasons to stay quiet." She paused. "I have a therapist now who says I've spent 41 years confusing love with compliance. I'm starting to think she's right." "I'm sorry, Zoe," she said, genuinely. That afternoon I found a moment alone with Roberta in the living room. She was watching the window. I sat across from her. "I need to ask you something," I said. She turned toward me slowly. "All right. That Thanksgiving, when you told me to leave, what were you actually afraid of?" She was quiet long enough that I thought she had decided not to answer. "I was afraid Andre was going to be ordinary," she said finally. "I had not expected that. His father and I spent our whole lives working for things that were good enough," she said. "I had a picture of what Andre's life was supposed to look like, what his family's life was supposed to look like. And you didn't fit the picture." She looked at her hand in her lap. "That's not an excuse. I understand that." "No," I said, "it's not. You were 27 years old and working a diner job and you seemed fine with it. I couldn't understand that. I couldn't separate what I wanted for my son from what I was ashamed of for myself. So you set a place at the table for someone else," I said, "and brought her to our family Thanksgiving without telling me, with my daughter sitting in the corner." She didn't deny any of it. She just sat with it. For the first time since I had arrived, Roberta wasn't reframing anything. She was just sitting there in her recliner with her left hand that didn't quite do what she told it, looking at what she had done. "I am sorry," she said. "I was wrong. I humiliated you in your own family's home on a holiday, with your child watching. I cannot give you those 7 years back." I nodded once. "No, you can't." "Are you going to leave?" she asked. "Not yet," I said. We sat there a while. Outside the window, a neighbor walked a dog through the late afternoon light, the particular thin gold of November in North Carolina. That evening Andre made dinner. The 5 of us sat at the table. Same dining room, different everything else. After the meal, Roberta looked at me and said she would like Harper to visit more. Both of us, if that was possible. I set my fork down. "I want to be clear about something," I said. Everyone waited. "I've forgiven you," I said, looking at Roberta. "Not because you've earned it, but because staying angry for another 7 years would cost me more than it would cost you. That's not generosity. That's just math." I kept my voice even, but forgiveness doesn't mean everything goes back to the way it was. It means I'm willing to build something different. Those are not the same thing. She held my gaze. "I will bring Harper to visit. She deserves to know her family, but I decide when and how often. Not you, not Andre, me." I looked around the table, and there are no more surprises, no arrangements made without my knowledge, no decisions about Harper's life that don't go through her father and me first. "That's fair," Edmund said. It was the first direct thing he had said to me since I walked through the door. I looked at him. It would have been fair 7 years ago too. He accepted that without arguing. Yes, it would have been. Roberta nodded once, slowly. "I understand." "I'm not looking for a perfect relationship," I said. "I'm looking for an honest one. If that's something everyone here can manage, then we have something to build on. If not, Harper will still know her family, but I won't sit at your table and perform like everything is fine. I'm done with that." Kezia looked at me. "What about you and me?" "You told the truth this afternoon," I said. "That matters. We start there." Andre was quiet through most of it. Finally he said, "I should have said something at Thanksgiving." "Yes," I said, "you should have." "I don't know if sorry is enough." "It's not," I said, "but it's a place to start." A year passed in the way years do, when the people in them are actually trying. Roberta kept going to physical therapy. Her left hand improved enough that she started complaining about the exercises instead of quitting them, which Kezia told me was the best sign possible. Edmund drove to Atlanta in October and sat in a folding chair on a cold Saturday morning to watch Harper play soccer. He called her Miss Sunshine when she ran past him, and she turned and beamed at him like she'd been waiting to hear it for years. Kezia and I started talking on the phone every few weeks, not about the family mostly, about our jobs, her kids, a book she'd read, something absurd that had happened at the grocery store, the kind of conversation that builds slowly into something real. She said things to me she couldn't say to anyone in Raleigh who had known her whole life. I said things to her that were easier to say to someone who had been in the same room and seen it from a different angle. Harper turned 14 in November. She was writing short stories for her English class, quiet, careful stories about ordinary things that turned out to matter. She read one to me over the phone one evening, about a girl who moves to a new city and eventually realizes the thing she missed most about her old life was something she'd actually been carrying with her the whole time. I didn't tell her what it made me think of. I just said it was beautiful, and I meant every word. The following Thanksgiving, Harper and I drove north to Raleigh. We arrived in the late afternoon to a table with exactly the right number of place settings and a sweet potato casserole Roberta had made herself, slowly, using her recovering left hand, which, according to Kezia, had taken most of the morning. Roberta did not tap her glass. Nobody made any announcements. After dinner, Harper and Edmund disappeared to the living room with a deck of cards, picking up a tradition from a single afternoon 7 years earlier as if no time had passed at all. Kezia and I washed dishes and talked about nothing in particular. Andre put the folding chairs away. I stepped out onto the back porch for a few minutes. The November air was the same cold it had always been, sharp in my chest before I felt it anywhere else. I could hear Harper laughing from inside. 7 years earlier, I had walked out of a house with my daughter and a bag of crayons and a long dark drive ahead of me. I had been told I didn't belong. I had driven away with a 6-year-old asking if they'd done something wrong and no good answer to give her. What followed that night was a studio apartment with a tension rod curtain, a licensing exam I failed once and passed once, a desk in a corner where I worked after my daughter went to sleep, and eventually a door with my name on it that I had gotten there entirely on my own. And now this, a porch in Raleigh in November, a table inside with enough chairs, people trying imperfectly to be honest with each other. I had not come back because anyone had finally deserved it. I came back because I had built something solid enough under me to choose it freely. And because that freedom, the freedom to decide, was the thing nobody at that Thanksgiving table had been able to take away from me, no matter how hard they'd pointed at the door. I went back inside, sat down in the chair nearest the window, and stayed for the rest of the evening. What would you have done if you were in my place? I read every comment, and I'd really love to hear from you. If stories like this are the kind that stay with you, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you soon.